Hello everyone, welcome back to SwitchUp. My name is Glenn and today we have a slightly different video for you. Now anyone that's watched the channel for any period of time will probably know by now that I am the more retro gamer of the two of us and the Super Nintendo is probably my favourite console of all time. Well, after months, if not a couple of years of speculation, Nintendo obviously announced the Super Nintendo online subscription service at the recent Nintendo Direct, so I thought I'd have a look at the 20 games that have been announced and just give you a little bit of information on each one. Okay, let's get into it. First up then we have Brawl Brothers, which is a beat 'em up which was developed and published by Jaleco and released in 1992. It was a sequel to another Super Nintendo brawler called Rival Turf. It's playable in 1 or 2 players and has 5 characters to choose from. The game was known for an angry mode which saw injured players receive a burst of energy and strength. Breath of Fire is an RPG that was released by Capcom back in 1993 in Japan and 1994 in North America. The story follows a boy named Ryu, yes, Capcom really do like that name, as he attempts to save his sister. Breath of Fire received a sequel on the Super Nintendo and further entries on other platforms, and I fully expect that the sequel will make its way to the service at some point in the future too. Demon's Crest is a 1994 side-scrolling platformer, also from Capcom, and is the third in the Gargoyle's Quest trilogy, following the first game for the Game Boy and the second one for the NES. Although this one drops the light RPG elements from those games and just focuses on the platforming. It has a link to another Capcom series, Ghouls and Ghosts, as you play as the red antagonist demon in those games, Firebrand. A physical copy of this game is extremely expensive these days due to the game's poor sales back then, but it's a great game, very difficult but well worth playing. F-Zero is a futuristic racer and the first in the F-Zero series, a series which has laid dormant for some 15 years now. It was one of the launch games for the Super Nintendo in Japan, America and Europe and was lauded by critics for its speed, fluidity and its gameplay. It was a showcase for the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 capabilities, which allowed the track to be scaled and rotated around the vehicle to simulate a 3D environment. Now Joe & Mac 2 was a real surprise for me, as the original Joe & Mac is one of my favourite Super Nintendo games, but it nor its sequel were games that I ever expected to see on such a service. This is a 2D platform adventure developed by Data East and released in 1994 in Japan and America and 1995 in Europe. The crown belonging to the chief of the Cali village has been stolen and it's up to Joe and Mac to try and retrieve it. I loved the prehistoric setting and dinosaur bosses of the first game, and whilst I've never played this sequel, its arcade sibling is actually already available on the Switch via the Johnny Turbo arcade line. Kirby's Dream Course is a miniature golf game where Kirby acts as the ball. You must defeat enemies and land in the hole, with Kirby being able to acquire different abilities from his enemies, which must then be used to complete the courses. Released in 1994 in Japan and 95 elsewhere, this is a very fun game with a simple premise that can keep you hooked for quite a few hours. Another Kirby game in Kirby's Dream Land 3, which is a platformer and a sequel to the 2 Kirby's Dream Land games on the original Game Boy. It holds the title of being the last game published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo in North America, and its gameplay mechanics are very similar to most Kirby games. Your animal friends from Part 2 return, and the game uses a lovely, almost pastel-drawn art style, made possible by a mode of the SNES called Pseudo High Resolution, which allowed for colour blending between two adjacent pixels. Pilotwings, released in 1990 in Japan, was a launch release in America in 1991 and released in Europe in 1992. This is a game that I put some serious hours into as a kid. It's a flight simulator which sees you trying to obtain your flying license for various vehicles by way of a series of tests. This game had you flying through rings long before Superman 64 was a twinkle in Titus's eye, and is another game to make use of the SNES Mode 7 capabilities. It's still very playable to this day, and its Nintendo 64 sequel is one of my favourite games of all time. Perhaps we'll get that at the next Direct, though probably not. Star Fox, or Star Wing as it was known over here in the UK, is another game I have huge nostalgia for. I remember playing this with my cousin as we both sat on dining room chairs with the stereo speakers positioned either side of us to make our own spaceship and make the most of the stellar soundtrack. Yeah, we were nerds back then. Developed by Nintendo and programmed by Argonaut Software, the game made use of Argonaut's Super FX chip, an additional processor built into the cartridge which helped the SNES better render the game's graphics, which allowed it to render hundreds of simultaneous 3D polygons. It might look primitive now, but it blew us away back then, and will probably be the first game I boot up. I just need to move the speakers first. Stunt Race FX, or Wild Tracks as it was known in Japan, is another game to make use of the Super FX chip. It's a 3D style racer with cartoony vehicles, and I still have a pristine boxed copy of this game to this day. It received mixed to good reviews back in the day, but it's not one of the usual suspects that have been released on Virtual Console systems of the past, so it's nice to have a bit of variety this time. Earth Defense Force is a horizontal shooter released by Jaleco in 1991 in Japan and 92 elsewhere, and was originally an arcade game. This is not to be confused with the Earth Defense Force bug shooter titles that have subsequently released in later years. Super Ghouls and Ghosts is a legendary title infamous for its difficulty. Released by Capcom back in 1991 in Japan and America and 92 in Europe, you take on the role of the knight Arthur as he attempts to rescue his love from the Emperor Sardius. Get hit once and you lose your armour instead of running around in your boxer shorts. Get hit again and you lose a life, and you will lose many lives. It's the third game in the series following arcade hit Ghosts and Goblins, and the second game, Ghouls and Ghosts, which was also an arcade game, although it was ported to many systems, including the NES. Super Mario Kart is the original game in the Mario Kart series. It released in 1992 in Japan and America and 93 in Europe. It was a huge success and almost single-handedly created the kart racing subgenre. Again, using Mode 7 to rotate the screen around the vehicle, Super Mario Kart's racing gameplay was incredibly tight and its battle mode was insanely fun. It could be argued no other game in the series put so much emphasis on pure racing as the first one did, and whilst the later entries have taken the series in some fantastic directions, it's hard to beat the pure racing that this original delivered. Super Mario World was another launch title across all regions and is a side-scrolling platformer. Released explicitly as Super Mario Bros. 4 in Japan, although that subtitle was dropped everywhere else, it had a total of 96 levels and introduced the Cape power-up and of course new friend Yoshi. Legend has it that Shigeru Miyamoto had wanted to have a rideable dinosaur character ever since the first Super Mario Bros. Game, and he got his wish in Mario's 16-bit debut. Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island was a sequel to Super Mario World, but a game with a completely different gameplay style. This time you play as Yoshi as he attempts to escort the baby Mario to safety and rescue baby Luigi from the evil Kamek. Another legend says that this game's unique hand-drawn art style came from Miyamoto's dislike of the pre-rendered graphics used in Donkey Kong Country, but whether this is actually true remains to be seen. The game received universal acclaim for its gameplay and art style and is still very much revered to this day. Well, apart from baby Mario's constant crying perhaps anyway. Now, when I stood in Woolworths back in the early 90s, a copy of Super Metroid in one hand, Acclaim's Batman Forever in the other, and just enough money in my pocket to buy one, never had I faced a harder choice. The box art to Super Metroid had a Space Marine fighting a dragon, but Batman Forever had Jim Carrey in it. I was an impressionable child. Thankfully, I made the right choice that day and experienced one of the most atmospheric, expansive and thrilling games I'd ever known. A Metroidvania before the term Metroidvania even existed, this game has to be experienced and there is no better time than now. Super Puyo Puyo 2, the Super Famicom version of Puyo Puyo 2, is included, and I believe this one only made it to America and Europe in its reskinned form of Kirby's Avalanche. Puyo Puyo is much more common these days and there are a few versions on the Switch already, but it's a series that took its time to leave Japan on Nintendo consoles. Another game I played a lot back in the day and one of many SNES games to use the word super in its title. It played from a fairly unique behind the player perspective, not quite the top-down view of sensible soccer, but not the side-on view that was also popular in football games of that time. This is a surprising inclusion, but I take it as a positive sign that we'll be getting some lesser known releases for the first time really since the Wii's Virtual Console. Super Tennis was released in 1991 in Japan and America, and I believe it was a launch title in Europe in 1992. This is a very underrated sports title that still holds up pretty well to this day. You can play on grass or clay, in singles or doubles, and you can also take on the circuit mode. Finally, we have The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which released in Japan in 1991 and America and Europe in 1992. It was the third game in the Zelda series following the NES games The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2 The Adventures of Link. In some ways it really defined what Zelda would become to be known as. Although similar to the original in terms of its gameplay, the shift in gameplay mechanics for the sequel meant that a Zelda formula hadn't really been established yet at that time. Well, this game did that and more. A fantastic action-adventure game that still holds up to this day. A Link to the Past is an all-time classic. So there you have it, a little bit of information on the 20 games released on the Super Nintendo Online service so far. Which games would you like to see follow? If I had to pick 3, I would go for a quite traditional one in Donkey Kong Country, one of my favourite games, but also Turtles in Time, a fantastic game, and Shadowrun, a great RPG that I believe was originally based on a board game. Anyway, let me know yours down below. I hope you've been enjoying this extra content we've been getting out lately. We're going to really try and ramp it up in the weeks to come. A quick thank you to our Patreons, as always, for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.